welcome back. You've now completed your Chapter 5 exam. It was fun, wasn't it? And now we're going to take what we've learned and add to it by way of talking about categorical syllogisms. So rather than making just immediate inferences, that is, an inference from a single proposition to another proposition, we're going to make an inference from two propositions to a third. So what we'll have is a set of arguments still constituted by categorical propositions, except that rather than dealing with two classes of thing, we'll be dealing with three. So this week we're going to start with the basics of a categorical syllogism from the standpoint of the modern interpretation, and then we'll move on to testing syllogisms for validity using Venn diagrams, and the method that we've already learned will be useful because it'll be a foundation for us to add on to. And then we'll also learn how to test a syllogism for validity by way of what are known as the rules of the syllogism. We'll also look at how we can test an argument for validity an argument from the traditional interpretation of the universal for validity. So our system continues in the following way. We're dealing with categorical propositions, and we're interpreting our universal propositions either according to the traditional or Aristotelian model or the modern or Boolean model. So let's get started. On sections A and B. And then next week we will continue with, if I'm not mistaken, our remaining sections, C through E. And in between, we will have some time to practice together. Using the material from Chapter 5 as our foundation. So there will be plenty of concepts and at least a couple of skills that you can carry over from Chapter 5 to Chapter 6. First, we're going to define the categorical syllogism. When we have a categorical syllogism, we have a deductive argument that is constructed entirely of categorical propositions. The categorical syllogism has two premises and a conclusion. So let's take a look at this example. All comedians are shy people. Some comedians are good actors. And then the conclusion, which is under the line separates the premises from the conclusion. Therefore, some good actors are shy people. So let's notice a couple things here about the argument. Okay, so notice that we have the class of comedians repeated in each of the premises. In the conclusion, however, the repeated term drops out and we're left respectively with the, in this case, predicate of the second premise and the predicate of the first premise. So we're going to name these elements and we'll use these from here on out. First, let's talk about the minor term. The minor term we label as S, and this is the subject class of the conclusion. So you already know from Chapter 5 that that a single categorical proposition includes a subject class and a predicate class, and the subject class is the grammatical subject of the sentence. When we move to looking at the categorical syllogism, we are going to use S to designate the subject class of the conclusion. So if you're not already given your argument in standard form, you're going to first want to identify the conclusion so that you can identify the subject class. The predicate class is, the predicate class of the conclusion is the known as the major term. And so what we want to do is respectively put an S and a P, or I said respectively, so I should say a P and an S over the classes in the relevant premise and conclusion. Now, one other point to make, and I'll come back at it again later, but you'll always have, when your argument is in what's known as standard form, your predicate class of the conclusion appear in the first premise. So it happens to be in this case the predicate class of the premise, but it could also be the subject class of the premise. Now hold on, I'm not going to try and confuse you yet. In fact, I won't try at all. It gets confusing all on its own. But once you get into the system, you'll get everything down and you'll be fine. Okay, the last term you need to know about is what's known as the middle term, and this is the repeated class in your argument. So every categorical syllogism will have a subject class of the conclusion, which is your minor term. Predicate class of your conclusion is your major term, and these appear each in their respective premises. And then the repeated term in the premises is the middle term, and that drops out in the conclusion. Okay, so now let's talk about how we can label our premises. Remember, we talked about the predicate of the conclusion being called the major term. And by and large, the major term is called such because it's the larger class into which the subject class of the conclusion either is distributed into or excluded from, or in the case of an I proposition, neither. The major term is the predicate of the conclusion, and it is what appears in the major premise. So shy people appears in the first premise, that's called the major premise. The minor term, good actors, appears in the minor premise. So when we put a categorical syllogism into standard form, and we'll want to do this specifically when we're looking at testing an argument by way of the rules of a syllogism, or when we're given our argument in a shorthand form known as mood and figure. So you do want to know what your major and your minor premises are. You want to know that your major premise includes your major term. Your major term is the predicate of the conclusion. Your minor premise includes the minor term. The minor term is the subject of your conclusion, and your middle term is the repeated term in the premises. When we're testing a categorical syllogism for validity by way of Venn diagrams, we don't need to put the argument in standard form, but it's really good practice. Okay, next thing is the diagram. You recall that two classes of thing give us two circles, and they overlap so that we can diagram them according to their quantity and quality. And we saw when we looked at the complement of a class that there were cases that we diagrammed the area for, that is the area that is outside both the subject class and the predicate class. So with two classes, there are two circles, but remember, we have not only the major term and the minor term, we also have the middle term. So we have another circle to add to our mix. Some of you are going to like the numbering because when we start to shade an X and so forth, it'll be easier to say, okay, shade areas 1 and 2, rather than saying shade the area of M outside of P, for example. So I'll do both, but you might want to just be comfortable with the numbering that is given, because this is just sort of standard numbering in pretty much any textbook you find. All right, when we diagram our universal propositions in a syllogism, we know that we diagram by way of shading, and we do not assume that there is a member of the relevant subject class. So here is a case in which we have a universal affirmative in which in the sort of imagined syllogism, we have the major premise, all P are M. How do we know it's the major premise? Because the major premise includes the major term. The major term is the predicate of the conclusion and is symbolized with capital P. So to say all P are M means we shade areas 6 and 7. Now, we shade areas 6 and 7 without concern for what's happening in the S class. That's because the sentence is about the relationship between P and M and has nothing to do with the S class. Take a look at the E proposition. Here we have a minor premise. How do we know that? Because we're told no S are M, and S is the subject of the conclusion, which designates the minor term, and the minor term goes in the minor premise. Here, then, areas 2 and 3 are shaded to show us that we're dealing with the exclusive, mutually exclusive relationship between S and M. Notice also here that we've been given in the first diagram and the second diagram 2 premises. One thing to bear in mind, and we'll talk about this again, is the following. We will always only diagram premises. And if, when we correctly diagram the premises, the conclusion is thereby also diagrammed, we know the argument is valid. More on that later. Now let's talk about how we diagram a particular claim. So let's take a look at the I proposition. In this case, it's the major premise, some P are M. Now off to the side here, I am going to try and get my pen to work. Here we go. I am going to draw M and P. So one of the things that you might do when you're first learning to diagram the elements of a categorical proposition is get rid of the clutter. And by that I mean, since you know that you're not dealing with the S class at this point, you know that you are going to be concerned with just putting the X in the area of overlap between M and P. However, do notice that because we don't know if this X will or will not end up being in the part of the P class that overlaps with S, we put the X on the line. And this is something we're going to come back to again and again. It's a really important point. So your X is always going to straddle a line within the 3 circle areas when you're not sure if it is or is not part of the class that is not presently being diagrammed, right? So now when I go back to the circles that I was just drawing, I bring my S class back in, and you can see that the X is straddling. Here's another example of a line straddling X, this time for an O proposition. And the X is straddling the line between areas 5 and 6 specifically, because it's not at all clear that the X that is an S but not an M is also not a P. It could be a P or not. We're just not sure. Now, don't take this to mean that you're always going to have an X straddling a line when you have a particular proposition to diagram. That's not the case. But you should know that when you are diagramming your premises, you are going to want to clearly show that it is not specific where the X goes, and this will bear on whether or not an argument is valid. One thing that I also want to point out again is that when you are dealing with your diagramming, or sorry, your X in your diagrams, you're not going to have an X that is on the line that straddles a class and something that's entirely outside of all three classes. What you're not going to get is an X here or here or here, right? So this is never going to be the case. This is not what you're going to find in your instructions for diagramming. Okay, so your X's will always be somewhere within the areas of overlap of these circles, or within one of the classes but outside the others. In other words, you'll have an X in, let's say, area 1, 5, or 7. You could also have an X in area 2. You could have an X in area 3, 4, or 6. And then, of course, the aforementioned line straddling areas. Okay? But these, never, 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 not going to happen. Okay. So now let's go ahead and take a look at an example. We have the following. Some designer drugs are addictive chemical substances. Some illegal drugs are not designer drugs. Therefore, some illegal drugs are not addictive chemical substances. The shortened version of the argument is some D are A, some I are not D. Therefore, some I are not A. The argument is in standard form. Recall that the repeated term in the premises, here D, is the middle term, I is the minor term, and A is the major term. Some designer drugs are addictive chemical substances. So let me go ahead and start from the ground up, even though you've got the completed diagram here. So some designer drugs are addictive chemical substances. So here's D and A. And I'm going to put the X right here in the area of overlap. Now we need to deal with the third class. Some illegal drugs are not designer drugs. So I'm bringing in the illegal drugs. Now it's kind of a weird circle I've just drawn. Notice that we've got the X in the on the line because we don't know if the designer drugs that are addictive are also illegal or not. Some illegal drugs are not designer drugs, so we need an X in the area of I that is outside of D. And that means we put the X here on the line between I and A. Okay, so just to clarify, we diagram each premise separately, and we have the line straddling X's because it's not clear whether or not the thing that is a designer drug and an addictive chemical substance is or is not illegal. And it's also not the case that we know if the X that is the illegal drug is or is not addictive. Now, one thing you could do if you want, it will make things a little bit more visually complicated, but it certainly wouldn't be wrong to do. Of course, I've run out of room here. Sorry about that. So we've got D, I, A. Some designer drugs are addictive. You could put an X here and an X here. In other words, you could put an X in area 4 and in area 3. That's separating out the line straddling, right? You're saying, okay, could be here, could be here. Similarly, some illegal drugs are not designer drugs, so we could say that there's an X here or here. That's area 5 and area 6 respectively. And notice what we find. Remember that an argument is valid when it's impossible for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true. But notice here, some illegal drugs are not addictive chemical substances. Well, it looks like that could be true, but it could also be false. And we can't have this could be, right? The conclusion has to be unequivocal. Here's another example, and this time we get to shade, and I want to tell you about the rule whereby when you have at least one universal premise and the other is a particular premise, you always diagram the universal first so you know what areas are not available to the particular claim. Here, again, I'm going to break things up. We have the following. All expensive presents are luxury items. Oops, back up. All expensive presents are luxury items. And we are shading area 1 and 4, which is to say we're shading the entire area of E that's outside of L. Now we're in a position to bring in our second premise, which in fact is our major premise, but because it's a particular, we're going to diagram it last. Some birthday gifts are expensive. We've got to put the X here in area 3. Why? Because this is the only birthday expensive gifts area that is available to us for our particular claim. Now we stop. Sorry, I've made things worse with this, trying to make my X clearer, and I made it look sort of shading. This is an X. X. Now let's look at the conclusion. Some luxury items are birthday gifts. Yes. Take a look at this area of overlap, right? It's true that there is at least one luxury item that is also a birthday gift. The argument is valid. All right, so we've just walked through the first part of chapter 6 where we covered some important concepts and some important skills. Specifically, we looked at what it means to say that an argument is in standard form. So we identified the major premise, the minor premise, and the conclusion. We saw that the conclusion of an argument provides us with the elements of the major and the minor premises. Specifically, the predicate of the conclusion contains the major term. The major term goes in the major premise. That's first in the order. The subject of the conclusion, the subject term of the conclusion, expresses the minor term, and that goes in the minor premise, which is second in the order. Remember that we labeled these respectively as P for major term, predicate of the conclusion, S for minor term, which is the subject of the conclusion, and then recall the repeated term in the premises is the middle term. We then went on to look at how we can diagram a syllogism using the modern interpretation of the universal. That is, we do not assume that there is a member of the subject class for the universals, so no existential import. And we learned some tips and some rules for diagramming our vens in order to determine whether or not the argument in question is valid. So we will, before we move on to our next set of sections, do a fair amount of practice. So look out for some practice videos, or actually look out for a practice video this week in which we will do a fair amount of practice. And of course, as always, if you have questions, let me know.